Susan, I think we'll call a meeting to order. Commissioner Strand is just delayed, but maybe his car trouble or something, but we have a lot to get through here this morning, so it's okay if we start? So we'll call the meeting to order. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda? Oh, we don't have to do that, or? No.
Diana's saying yes, you do. Diana's saying yes, you do have to approve the agenda.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the 2024 August 19th, 23rd, and November 25th?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Yes, carries. Susan, sales tax?
Okay. Yes, so the standing items are typically, we look at sales tax historically and year-to-date financials. Sales tax, this is not new information. We're waiting, we should be getting the November data today or tomorrow. So this is through October. It shows just a very slight increase, 0.5%. November is historically not a strong month, so I'm kind of actually waiting until February to see what we do for the full year. Regarding year-end financials, so as those of you that have been through this before know, December's not over for accountants until probably March or April. So we're still working through some year-end numbers. So at this point, I don't have a good estimate. Once we close January, I should be able to work on projections, but nothing that I've seen so far is any different than what we've talked about. I do expect results. Revenues in excess of expense, and then we'll move that to transit like we talked about at a prior meeting. So I set this January meeting up as a standalone meeting so that we could focus on financial information. We've done that in the past, but we've had other things that have come up, and so I wanted this to really just be able to talk through some of the financial issues we've been discussing. So I want to provide some background and update on some of the topics we have been discussing, and then also some new things that have come up, all with the 2026 budget in mind. So I know this is going to be a lot of information for you. I printed out some slides so you can take notes, but I promise we will send you the full deck in full view when this is over. Again, it's an overview, so we can revisit things later, or if you want to set up individual meetings. And then I intend this to be a discussion, so please ask questions and we can talk as we go along. Morning, Commissioner Strand. And also, thank you. I know you guys have a really busy day, so I'm glad you could start it out with finance. So first off, I just wanted to introduce you to some of the senior leadership within the finance team. They are working behind the scenes, but they're so very, very, very important. So we have Tanner Smithhammer. He's our purchasing manager. You might have met him during some of the purchasing discussions. And then Jordan Corneliuson and Wyatt Pappenfuss are our finance managers. The two of them really kind of rallied the troops sort of in the interim between when Kent's resignation and when I started, so I really appreciate all their efforts. And then Jamie Bullock is the Assistant Director of Finance. You've seen her at other meetings. Jamie brings a wealth of information. She was here for 15 years, took a short hiatus, and I'm very glad she's back. So Jamie's leading the ERP transition, but she's also involved in kind of all aspects of finance. So they're a fantastic team. We're very, very blessed to have all of them. So just to kind of give a head start, so on the screen are the finance-related topics that we have talked about in some degree. A lot of them were independent meetings, and then also a few new items. The top three are the ones I want to focus on today, but I just want to remind everyone of the other things that we have talked about. And all of these things are very interrelated, and they have major implications on the financial health of the city. So we're going to talk about fund balance and debt levels, legislative property tax discussions, new public safety sales tax, and then the other items are compensation plan, infrastructure sales tax that has a pending sunset, cost of urban services, parking fund, the cost of technology, the changes we're going to be making to the land development code and related incentive discussions, and then the capital improvement plan that we talk about every year. So I laid out this agenda in what I hope is kind of a way that starts at the foundational level and we can build on things as we move through the list. So these are what were listed on the agenda, 5 items, and then as we have time, I sent out a draft policy for you to look at, and we can spend some time looking at it as we have time, talking about a few things. So the first thing is the big picture. And what do I mean by the big picture? So governmental accounting, it's designed around very specific funds and fund categories. And during the budget process, we really only talk about the general fund and a few capital funds. However, we have many, many, many other funds. So this crazy spreadsheet, which I'm not going to show in detail, is something I started when I first started working here to help me keep track of the fund numbers and what comes and goes from each fund. What I wasn't able to represent is how things move from one to the other. So basically, finance is kind of a complicated spider web of a lot of different financial activity. But I think it's important that we get an understanding of kind of all of the funds, because we're going to need to understand that farther into the presentation. So I want to thank Emily Groth with Comms to help me make this a little more understandable. We're not going to go through all of these in detail, but we have 2 basic types of funds: governmental funds, which are, they count for the resources that typically come from tax revenue and other public sources. And then on the right is the proprietary funds. We often call them enterprise funds or the utilities. And those are the funds that most often act like a regular business. And then within the governmental funds, there are 5 kind of buckets. The orange on the top left is the general fund, 101. That's the one that we talk about most often. And really, it's kind of the catch-all. It reports all resources that aren't supposed to be recorded elsewhere. Moving down, special revenue funds, those are restricted for specific types of activity. Blue is capital projects, as it says. It's for capital outlays, and that's other than what goes in the proprietary, the enterprise funds. Yellow is fiduciary. Those are things that we hold for other parties. And then debt service is the accumulation of resources for the payment of debt. We're going to spend some time on that. So we'll get into that in more detail. Then I'm just going to breeze through these. I intended to talk a little more about them, but I realize that all of you aren't as excited about this detail as accountants are. But I think it's important that you see kind of all the activity that goes on. So the general fund, this should look somewhat familiar. This is what we talk about during the budget. So down the left side are all the departments that are funded through the general fund. And then we have columns showing what typically comes in that fund and what goes out. And those are the buckets that we talk about during the budget: taxes, property taxes, franchise fees, governmental revenue, services, permits, and fines. And then outgoing are that pie graph that shows 70% is personnel, about 29.9% is operating expenses, and then we have a little sliver of capital projects. So move to special revenue funds. We have 2 pages of special revenue funds. You can see what goes in and what comes in and what goes out. We have 2 pages of capital project funds. Same thing, what goes in and what goes out. The very first one, 401, that is what Tom Nachmuth talks about when he talks about the capital improvement plan. And we see how complicated the funding is of that. We get grants, federal and state money. We have money coming from sales tax. We have money coming from rates. We have money coming from different funds. We have prairie dog funds and bond proceeds. So those are really, really important conversations that we have. Fiduciary funds, those are things we're taking care of for someone else. So we have 3 pensions. Current employees are on North Dakota PERS, but there was an old city pension. We also have police and fire pension. And then we are the fiscal agent for the diversion authority. So we track their bookkeeper, basically. Debt service, I have these kind of bucketed by kind of type of what's the purpose of them and what's the revenue. We're going to talk a lot more about this in a different slide. And then these are the proprietary funds. It's the utilities and the facilities and transit. These are primarily driven by the rates that we charge. So as we talk about the budget, it's important that we're capturing all the expenses to make sure that the rates are covering those. So that is kind of the background. Now let me catch up on my notes. So we'll get to the good stuff, as Brenda told me yesterday. So we want to talk about some key metrics, the fund balance, and our debt levels. Last fall, we talked about our Moody's bond rating. This was the call that was attached to the appropriation bonds in September, and then we had a follow-up call with no change in November when we did the refunding improvement bonds. So our current rating at September is an AA2 with a negative outlook. So I've listed the scale, and you can see on the left, Moody's has a scale that has investment grade and non-investment grade. Investment grade goes from Baa3 all the way to AAA. The arrow points to where Fargo is. We are AA2. And then the definition, AAs are obligations that are judged to be of high quality and are subject to very low credit risk. And notice that there's an AA1, AA2, and AA3. Then, but the negative, what did that mean? So the negative is the outlook. And the negative outlook, this is the definition straight from Moody's. So the outlook reflects the growing likelihood that the city's available fund balance ratio will remain materially less than 25% of revenue, coupled with the leverage ratio that will remain somewhat elevated. If the reserves do not materially improve, the rating is likely to move downward or a downgrade. So really, the key items that they mention are available fund balance and, to a lesser extent, I think a much lesser extent, our leverage ratio. So I want to spend a little time on fund balance. So when I say fund balance, notice I'm not saying reserves. I think the word reserves kind of mischaracterizes the concept, and I think it's important that we all understand what fund balance is and what it isn't. So as is noted up there, fund balance, it's a financial calculation at a specific time, typically at year end. It represents the difference between assets and liabilities, and it's our spendable and our non-spendable resources that we can use to meet future obligations. It's very dependent on cash. But what it isn't is it's not synonymous with cash. It's not physically segregated. I can't point to it somewhere except as a line on a report. And I think this gets, particularly the fund structure makes this a little more complicated than it needs to be. So I did a couple examples that I think make it a little more clear. So in personal finance, when you think of yourself, an individual has assets and liabilities, and the difference is often referred to as what is your net worth. So you can see you have liquid cash, you have long-term cash, you might have a car, a home, you have some short-term debt, you have some long-term debt. So in here, your net worth is $900,000, but it is not the same thing as your cash. Did the same thing with the manufacturing company. Theirs is a little different because they are on an accrual basis, so they have things like receivables, they have inventory, prepaids. Same thing though, they have facilities and they have short-term debt and long-term debt. Their net is typically referred to as retained earnings. Again, not the same thing as cash. So for governmental, this is the City of Fargo's governmental funds at the end of 2023. Same thing, except for governmental, we do not record long-term assets and liabilities because they're not available to be used in the next year. So in this case, the term is fund balance. That's what we're talking about. So the fund balance of 30 million is not identical to cash. However, because we don't record long-term assets and liabilities, it's much more similar to cash than maybe some of the other ones. So that kind of sets up what is and what isn't fund balance. So this is an example of how we traditionally have calculated the fund balance. And it's usually a ratio of the general fund. So we take that fund balance and do some different calculations at the end of the year, look at what actually makes that up. And we have to look at what constraints are on them. So in the non-spendable bucket, you can't spend inventory, you can't spend prepaids. Under restricted is the cash only allowed for certain things, so we don't count that. So then there's 3 buckets in yellow. That's what's considered your available fund balance. And then we typically compare that to expenses. So the fund balance ratio here varies from 30 up to 35 in 2020. That was influx of federal money through COVID, and then we're now at 20%. However, after we got our rating from Moody's, we did kind of a deep dive in what and how Moody's looks at fund balance. They take more of an all funds approach, which is why I thought it was important for you to understand the complication of all the funds that we have. So we recreated their calculation back to 2019 to give some comparatives. So at the top for the revenue, governmental funds revenue, that is the pretty colored pie, the governmental funds. The business type activities are the purple revenues. And then we have fund balance, the government funds, those 3 things that are available. And then we also have the business net assets. And then they compare theirs, the available fund balance to total revenue. This ratio started at 25 in 19. It was 10 in 23. As they mentioned in their report, they think it should be 25. So when I was looking at this, I want to explain kind of what happened with the decrease. Between 21 and 22, the airport's no longer reported as part of the City of Fargo's financial statements. And as we talked about last summer, the airport maintained a lot of cash for their construction projects. So when they look at it in an all-funds basis, we didn't really change that much. But from Moody's perspective, we did, because they no longer carry those airport funds. And then 22 was kind of an anomaly. At the end of, in the fall of every year, we do that refunding improvement bond to pay ourselves back for all the construction we do.
Susan, just a quick question. When you mentioned the airport, was that because of our MOU and our separated, more defined relationship?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, and what are they called again in our financials? Say that again.
So we report them as a component unit, so they're in a separate column, whereas they used to be included as a proprietary business type fund.
So a bit of a technicality, but it's important for this calculation. 22 was just the timing of that refunding improvement bond, and so 23 we remedied that and did the bond in the fall. But what I want to show on this is the far right column, kind of the future example. So using Moody's methodology, and assuming our revenue stays about the same, which it likely won't, because if we're going to increase some of our water rates like we did, that'll probably go up a little bit, but assuming it stays the same, in order for us to move that needle from 10 to 20, not even to 25, but just to 20, we're going to need to double the cash balances within the government funds and the business type funds. That's a big lift, and it's not something we're going to be able to do overnight, but we're going to need to work towards that. That fund balance ratio is heavily dependent on cash, and like I said, it's going to take a significant influx to move the needle. Any additional questions on that? Comments?
What would be the difference if you're AA2 and you went down to AA3? What would be the bond interest rate we'd have to pay?
That's a very good question. I don't know, but that would be the difference. There would be some incremental difference in the bond rating. And I don't
Well, I just, and John, we argue about the airport, how much reserve fund they need. But I mean, it's almost you're chasing a reserve fund, but we don't have the cash available. I mean, we run a lean city budget. So great, you want to get to 25%, but if you don't have enough money to put in your savings account that way, that you're pursuing a dream you'll never hit.
Well, and that's a question that we're going to have to evaluate as we, clearly we do need to increase them somewhat, but, you as a group and with our help and research, are going to find out what is that magic number? Is $80 million of cash really something that the city wants to maintain, or 100 if we need to bump it up to 25? What's the basically incremental cost with the bond rating of that?
But you also said at one time we had to be between 15 and 25% in some of the readings that you gave the commissioners to read. So I'm curious why that one is bumping up, and then two, the public, for us to sit on $80 million seems like a lot of cash on hand sitting in the city of Fargo.
Agreed.
Susan, I have a question. So the negative outlook portion of the Moody's rating, if we were to have a strategy on how we are systematically building our funds, our cash, and we can talk about that with Moody's, is that part of the conversation?
Yes, for sure. In my bond call, the outlook, he said it's typically a 2-year window. If we can show some progress and, we have a plan, I think that would be a big part of my talking points. And then, Mayor, you had a question on the 15 to 20%. So that was how we used to do it. This is looking at kind of the traditional calculation, and that is just using general funds as a comparative of expenses. And then, like I said, Moody's uses all funds, and they compare it to revenues. In theory, revenues and expenses should be about the same because we're a nonprofit, we're a non-for-profit company or government, so they should be about the same.
Susan, are like Fargo Dome reserves included in our reserves?
They are, but they're actually long-term because they're more of an investment, whereas the airport they kept them in basically a savings account because they were more for impending capital needs. Okay, the other item that Moody's talked about was debt. I believe this is less significant to them because our ratio has stayed the same, but coupled with the fund balance, what they perceive as inadequacies, they also tied this up as an issue. So what I tried to represent on here, I did represent, is all of the city's debt as of 2023. The 24 column is an estimate. You're not going to be able to read all of these individually. If you want more information, it's 10 pages in the notes to the financial statement that Wyatt did a very good job on summarizing. But my intent is kind of to talk about this in generalities and sort of the buckets. So again, Moody's looks at our total debt versus our revenues on an all-fund basis. And at the bottom, in green, our ratios have fluctuated from 250% to 367%, and they kind of mention as their benchmark 350. It's fluctuated in the middle there in 21 because of COVID money. So the numbers here are represented in thousands. So when we look at line 8, total borrowing, it's 867 million to 1 billion. Then the green line below, number 9, that's some other non-debt obligations, which is things like our pension obligations. That brings us to the total debt, which is line 10. So again, about $1 billion to 1.3 billion. Clearly, that's a lot of money. But I think when we look at that, we also need to look at how it's structured, and that's how I kind of have it bucketed. So the blue, the first section, those are refunding improvement bonds. Those are what we use to pay ourselves back for capital construction costs. and it's assessed to the benefiting entity. So the debt structure is set up so that those special assessments pay that debt. The next group, the salmon color, that is enterprise debt, SRF, state revolving fund loans. It's enterprise debt, generally very favorable terms, usually not more than 2%, and sometimes we can even extend it out to 40 years. So that is, really obviously good borrowing terms. The repayment here is either infrastructure sales tax, so water gets a quarter of the 1% and wastewater gets a quarter, or it's rates, and those are all built into the revenue adequacy model.
Susan, bear with me. When we have development that takes place and we borrow and do bonds to fund those developments, those are secured, those debts, aren't they secured by the developer? And if a debt is secured, like they have letters of guarantee and security, if they're secured, is that a different type of debt than an unsecured debt?
That's a good question. I've never thought of it in that format. Yes, I would assume so. Yes, it's secured debt. We don't take out, well, most of our debt I can't think of a situation where we'd have unsecured debt, but what is your question related to that?
Well, like if we have a developer that takes us and does a major project and there's special assessments, and then, as I understand it, we borrow and then they owe it to us. And they give us a letter of security for it, supposedly.
I haven't done one of those yet, personally, but yes, Brenda would probably know that better.
Let me see if this is the right question, and we might have to do a little research on that, so because we have a letter of credit for the project, and that letter of credit only gets reduced as buildings become built, does that make that debt secure? So we hold on to that letter of credit, and then as buildings are built, should they be looking at it differently, or do they look at that differently, knowing we have that letter of credit? And I don't know that we've ever asked that question.
I haven't, but that's a good question. I'll do some research into that and get back to you on that. That would be more towards the improvement bonds. The blue ones, though, the state revolving funds are more for like the automated meter project or the expansion at the water treatment plant, those sorts of things.
Can I ask you a question, Susan? So the special assessments, that top line, is that all the special assessments for all the infrastructure, like in the new developments? Is that included in there?
Correct.
So that's the total amount that's out, long-term exposure for the city?
Correct.
Thank you.
So I just want to make sure, so Commissioner Pepcorn, it's a combination of all of our reconstruction projects and that greenfield, so it's everything.
Can I ask in the future if we could break that out separately? Because what I anticipate is we're going to reform special assessments, and in the future, the new developments hopefully are going to get transferred into the cost of the lots versus special assessed. And so I think in the future, we're going to want to know that. So if that's possible, I think that'd be good, because the vision is, obviously, we need to reform property taxes. That's the state legislature, but specials, we need to reform those. It doesn't mean eliminate them, but there's some things that we can break out. So, and I don't know if that makes sense, but if you could do that in the future, that'd be
I
good.
actually did that exercise on a smaller scale for something. It's a little more complicated because it's all lumped together as one debt, but we can look at it.
And I don't want to pile stuff on top of your head, because I know you just have a new system, but I do think this is one of the things that hopefully you'll be able to do, is to split that up, to have the greenfield development, one section. So thank you very much.
That does tie to a point. So I put 2024, that column is estimated based on our papers that we have right now. 2025 is some things I know that are going to change, and that very top line, this year our bond for refunding improvements was about 52 million. I know next year it's going to be more like 70 to 80, and that's some new development that we're assessing. So that is going to be one of my points, so thank you.
And I think the commissioners are going to have to be schooled up on the property tax that the governor's trying to do. I think we've had 10 to 12% growth, so that 3% cap doesn't work for us very well. If you look at the last 10 years, and Susan has a table, I think we can share with commissioners. But I think for the commissioners, we're going to have to sit down and talk about it, because we're going to have to decide as a group what our policy is and what we want. And right now, they're looking at the CIP, and I won't get into it today, it's just too much to do, but at some point, we're going to have to talk about that property tax and what makes more sense for the city of Fargo, so.
That's actually next on the agenda, so let me just have a few more, go through these. So pink are the general obligations and appropriation debt. That's what we pay out of the general fund. Green is flood-related. Those are all paid for by flood sales tax. Yellow is borrowing for the various parking facilities. Blue is tax increment finance-related debt, paid for by TIF revenues. Orange is miscellaneous. And then, it's important to know that as, obviously, this grows every year, but we're still making significant payments down every year. So kind of the last few years, average, we paid down about $60 million of debt. So I think, maybe keeping what we had, offsetting what we just paid off might be a good strategy.
Susan, the green number 9, did you say that includes flood protection in the diversion activities?
Number 4, yes.
Number 4.
Number 4. Or the green number 4 in the middle, yes, that's flood activities. Some flood projects that we did, I think it says 2013 and 2014. The city's still carrying that, but the diversion is actually making the payment for that.
Dumb question. The diversion is set up so that it, in theory, has a backup funding plan if ever needed, that it would trigger assessments. Do we monitor that to pay attention to how, are we getting closer to ever triggering that, or is it for sure never going to happen? Or I don't know how we pay attention to that or
The
not.
diversion authority's placing really close attention to that. Actually, Commissioner Grinberg, that's kind of, I think, one of his primary focuses for this year is to look at the long-term funding model for the diversion. We talk about that in the Finance Committee of the diversion quite a bit.
And I'll add Mayor Dardis is finance chair of the authority, is very much watching that. But I don't know, Commissioner Pepcorn and Mayor, if you want to add anything.
It's something we're watching very closely, John. It's not going to trigger right now, but that's what we're watching for. And actually, city commissioners, some of them want us to do our tax in 26 and do that again back to the flood. And Dave and I, and Denise, that's not something we'd like to see. We'd like to see that quarter cents go to whatever we want it to go to. But right now, there's no tax assessment is not going to be done, so.
So it's a real concern, John, because right now Minnesota has not participated. The one thing I would anticipate us changing is we've been relying on them for lobbying, and I think we need to consider us being in charge of the lobbying, because right now, what I've heard is Moorhead doesn't do anything. And so they're supposed to be one of our main partners. And so I think we need to look at the diversion authority, anyway, and it's a discussion for the diversion authority, but we can't rely, if we can't rely on our part, we got to do something, Mr. Mayor.
Well, what's happening right now, Dave, you did bring that up as an issue. Clay County and Moorhead now are coming back and lobbying. They have 2 lobbyists now going for that, but they very much know, and it's been raised by the North Dakota legislature as well, as you guys got to go get the money. So that is being pushed very hard this session. So the $50 million commitment is what they're looking for.
Susan, is there, in your opinion, an acceptable debt ratio number percentage that a healthy city is at?
What Moody's has mentioned is under 350, which we are, which is why I don't think they're primarily concerned about our debt level. They understand that our debt is kind of bucketed and it ties to specific revenue streams. But I think just we need to be mindful as we look at discretionary type purchases. Also, as Commissioner Pepcorn mentioned, the assessment model for developments, those things need to be monitored as well. And then we also need to pay attention. I know that utility debt through SRF is really cheap, but we just need to know that that also gets added on to the total debt load for Moody's calculation. Does anybody have any other questions on this?
Sorry, one comment on the utility debt. The nice thing there is the long-term, and you've been part of those, and Brenda, you're part of those utility meetings, but the long-term planning for the trends of knowing when those loans are paid and the impact to total debt with utilities, all of that's monitored.
Yes, absolutely. The a really good financial model plan. Okay, so now I want to move into legislative efforts, property taxes. So we all know that this is a live issue. And we've been told that there are 50-plus bills. So likely that some sort of legislation is going to come out of the session. What I've analyzed up here and been talking about primarily on our various calls with the League of Cities, and even the finance directors of the large cities are having weekly calls to talk about this, is House Bill 1176. This is the bill that ties with the governor's message. It also has support of all of the legislative leaders. It's the one that's been kind of bantered about, got rolled out right away. So that bill calls for a relief component, which is enhanced and additional credits that would be funded through the state by earnings on the legacy fund. And then it also focuses on reform. Reform is the one that is the most impactful to taxing entities. So as proposed, the bill will impose a limit of 3% revenue growth from local property taxes. And then within that, there are exceptions for growth in the form of like new parcels coming on, and then also any exemptions that are added or taken off regarding like Renaissance zone or other types of exemptions. So this is a lot of data, and it's kind of complicated. So I'll just briefly explain an overview, and then there's some columns I want us to look at. So this spreadsheet was created by another large city and shared with us, and I'm actually routing it around to some of the other large cities as well, because I think it's a good thing to look at. But with the help of Mike Splonskowski, we had to do some digging on some numbers. We put together this table, and it provides an estimated look back of the implications of this bill. So bear with me, a lot of numbers. So without getting into the weeds, I'm going to read my notes here. The spreadsheet compares the Fargo property tax revenues annual percent change, and we look at this during the budget, but we take out the exception for growth, and so we net to the yellow in the middle, which is the city of Fargo's annual tax percentage excluding new growth. So that would be kind of the base. Then we compare it to two different proposals. As we mentioned, that House Bill 1176 has a cap of 3%. And then the League of Cities is also proposed, just in discussion, kind of a modified model that would allow some change for CPI. So we have CPI or some other more appropriate regional index. CPI plus 2% plus new growth gives a different total to compare our yellow column to. What you see is in both of those scenarios, the positive red number is where we do not conform to the new process. So, any comments or questions on that?
Susan, the growth, if we went many years with a 7 to 14% valuation increase annually,
Yes, and that's.
which is a separate issue from mill levies, completely separate. One's a mill levy is what we apply to the valuations, and valuations are what we apply the mill levies to.
Correct.
When they're talking a 3% cap, are they saying that valuations can't go up more than 3%?
No, they're saying that the revenue that we assess can't go up. So there's not going to be, my understanding is there won't be a change in the way property's valued. Mike and James will still value it the same way, but we're going to have to somehow back into and demonstrate that what we're assessing as part of our budget is not 3% more than we did last year, not accounting for growth.
So if we have a valuation increase across the city of a substantial amount, we have to lower the equivalent mill levy then to have no more than a 3% cap.
Yes, somehow we're going to have to do that math. I'm kind of struggling with how that's going to work. It's going to need to be some funding formula of some sort. That's kind of why I'm partnering up with some of the finance directors in the other large cities. I'm sure the state will send us some guidance, but yes, exactly that.
What do they do, what happens when the market turns and we don't have valuation growths, which we've had in the past in North Dakota, where the market turns against us? And then, do they have those contingencies
They do
built
not,
in?
it would be limited to 3%.
Still limited to 3%?
Dave?
So I'll give you an example. So during COVID, we had a year where construction costs were exploding for our infrastructure. And so if this was in effect, we would essentially have to not do any of our infrastructure, which would push it later, which would cost way more. Correct, Brenda? You're the past engineering expert. So this would be catastrophic. And so what they're doing, and I think we should take action as a commission, this is during a commission meeting, but they want to cap us at 3%, they want to cap the county at 3%, but they don't want to cap themselves at all. And so to me, that's obviously hypocritical. And so we need to oppose this as strongly as possible, because this would be, just infrastructure alone would be catastrophic. I mean, literally, our engineering department, we would halt all projects. We would be able to do a handful each year if this happened, especially if we didn't anticipate COVID if you remember, construction costs were going up on a weekly basis. And so anyway, we need to do something about this. And it's just hypocrisy. Clearly, I would say if you're going to cap, let's cap the state at 3% too. Obviously, that's what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right, Mayor? All
Yeah,
right,
but we have to find a solution. I understand this comment, Dave, that you're making on that, but we're gonna have to find a solution, because you look at this and 50% of the time we would be not working.
Correct.
That favors the Minnesota model, which you're talking percentages, we're always on a mill. So if you can't quote 3%, you're gonna be at a mill in 0.123 or something, like some crazy number. That's not the model that North Dakota has. It has mill levies, so it doesn't even follow the pattern of what we do. And somebody in their head has, well, we'll just always hold property taxes to 3%. That doesn't work in the real world.
Can I just say, this is a good lesson for us to learn too. It's very easy to make rules for other people to live by and then exclude yourself. And I think that's what this is. They want to make rules for us and exempt themselves, and to me, that's unacceptable.
Just a couple other items on this, so.
I'm going to continue here for a moment. The Proposition 13 in California, if I remember right, when we had our vote in November on property taxes, the conversation was real similar back at that point in time about the impacts on us and on cities. But what'll happen is you increase all your fees for services. California, hasn't sunk after they limited their cap and put caps on. They just start charging for everything, everywhere more. So that's going to be our reality for the people. They'll still be paying somehow. Anyway.
So when you can consider this in relation to what we've talked about as part of the general fund budget, 70% of our expenses in the general fund are staffing. And we already know that based on the pay plan we have, 70% of those people get a step every year. Well, that's about 2% just with that. Then you need to add on a cost of living because we want to remain competitive. That's a pretty big chunk. And then the other items within the operating expenses are utilities and fuel, and those are incredibly volatile, supplies. So the math on this doesn't work very well.
To that point, I'll add, through the league calls and the work we're doing on this is the number one priority right now is this bill and work on property tax relief. But one of the strongest arguments has been, we're going to lose staff, and you lose staff, you don't have a city, because we cannot pay competitive wages. That alone is not doable
Yes.
with this.
So I take from the conversation today, where as a commission, not very happy with the present proposal. We like property tax relief, but the present proposal doesn't work for our community, our city. So Susan, I'd say we'd be working with you on continuing education, of what solutions come out that maybe League of Cities brings up or somebody brings up. But I think the commissioners need to be always informed. Okay, here's another plan. What do you think? So that we can obviously lobby the right way.
What's the school board association's position on this? Because schools are half the property taxes. We're just a fraction of it.
They're giving money to the
Tax us
school
to-
separate, John. They're trying to give money separate to the school. That's how they're, on some of this relief, they're increasing their stipend to the schools.
Per student payments or something, per daily pay.
I'm not sure how it is.
That 3% cap, though, to them will be huge.
Yes. Yes, but like the mayor said, they've talked about increasing the funding model per student. So, you know, it'll be a lot of us looking to the state for money, a lot of entities looking for their hands out.
We may want to talk with the schools and the parks as we're evolving our positioning on that topic legislatively. So we're not acting absent our partners locally.
The only other item I want to mention on this came up recently during our large city call, but I sent this off to our bond attorney so that she can look at the implications of that. Last fall, when I was having the Moody's call, we talked a lot about Measure 4. Moody's took the position that they don't ever react to a proposal because they don't want to influence any outcomes, so they were pretty tight-lipped about it. But you know, just from a municipal bond market for the entire state of North Dakota, what would something like this do? You know, investors are not going to be as confident. I mean, the whole basis of the bond market for municipalities is we pledge the full faith and to levy taxes, and if we're capped at that, you know, that will have some sort of reaction. So we'll see what she says on that. Okay, thank you. That was a really good discussion. I just want to touch just a little bit on the 2026 budget. We anticipate likely the same priorities and challenges that we faced last year. We're going to have to focus our revenue and expense decisions on increasing the cash balances. I'm going to suggest that we specifically budget a line item for the general fund balance increase, which will mean that we're going to budget revenues that are more than our expenses. That number will be, you know, as we talk through that, we need to look at strategic use of debt, ongoing compensation discussion, incorporate these legislative property tax initiatives, and really take a balanced approach with incorporating the new public safety sales tax, which will be the last item on the agenda.
Susan, when do the new revenue streams begin from the votes of the people in November for the sales taxes, like for the public safety vote and for the convention center? When are those streams already coming in?
No, they're very separate as well. So the public safety sales tax, that was approved, so the tax will take effect April 1st. So we don't actually see, you know, it's lagging, obviously. It's in effect in April. If I'm a business, I don't have to pay that. If I pay monthly, I don't have to get my return in until the subsequent month, so not till May. So the cash doesn't actually start coming until June for the monthly filers, and then those that file on a quarterly basis, it won't be till August. So we won't have that money till the summer.
That's the revenue side. Then when will be the dedication spending side of that?
That's the next agenda item, if you want to
All
just
right.
hold for a
But
second.
just, okay, well, I'll let you get there then.
Okay. So the, you know, implications and how to implement this, as we talked about, you know, one of the comments that Commissioner Strand made was back to the core mission. It's the function of government. Kind of need, you know, it's going to be a lifestyle change and a philosophy change if we're going to make some significant improvements. Collaboration, compromise, and consensus, I think, are the three themes. Just a bit about the timeline.
Can I just add, can we both go back a slide? So when you talk about words, there's a couple of words I want to add. One of them is transparency, and the other one is integrity. I love, you know, collaboration is wonderful, and I'm confused on what lifestyle change and philosophy shift means.
For me, how I perceive it, I guess, is can't look at this, let's just use a common term. This can't be just a short-term diet. It needs to be a lifestyle change. Like, we need to look at how, the decisions that are made and, we talked about getting back to the core mission. What are we doing? Is that necessarily a function of government? There's a lot of hard decisions that are going to need to be made.
So I'd like to add to that. What we need to do is get back to our core responsibilities. So to me, that's what we need to focus on. We've gotten into a lot of things that are not the fundamental responsibilities of local government, and I think that's what we need to focus on. But I insist on transparency, and that means all the commissioners have access to all the information going forward. That's critical, and that's what we represent the taxpayers, and if we aren't getting all the information, that's not acceptable. So I think those are very important words to add. I love collaboration, that's a great thing, but we need to have transparency and integrity. Thank you.
I certainly support transparency. I have since I've started, and appreciate these meetings. I'll add strategic is my word. Thank you.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the timeline. So we are, as staff, planning a February cabinet retreat that will talk primarily about financial issues, those things that we just talked about, back to the core mission, some philosophy issues. We have a February Finance Committee scheduled, so I'd like to bring forward more of a formal kind of budget plan with timing and such. There's some, decisions we need to make regarding what's the strategy for compensation this year, those types of things. Basically a plan for implementing the public safety sales tax. I think we can talk about that in more detail in February. As has been in the past, March through May are for department budget preparation. And then June and July is when I would like for the commission deliberations, and I think we need to talk through what that's going to look like. It needs to be more frequently and maybe more focused on certain things with different meetings. On an ongoing basis, of course, we have to monitor the property tax bills. And then I'm going to request, kind of on behalf of my team, that we attempt to make budget decisions much earlier this year. We're going to be right in the middle of our ERP implementation. As of now, our go live is scheduled for July 1. So this is going to overlap with that. And so the sooner we could get decisions made and things forwarded, that would really help the finance team. So.
What's EERP?
Oh, it's Tyler, our new software.
Oh, that's Tyler, all
Or
right.
Kevin, if you're the mayor.
Then I can check my Tyler questions off here. Good.
Yes. Yes.
I would say too, if we want to revisit our core mission and if we're making lifestyle changes, where spending is going, that we need to do that prior to all your work in February. Would that not make sense for the commission to have that laid out so you know what to work with? I mean, if we're going to be making cuts and changes.
Right, I think the
Going
February
forward.
meeting is to kind of whet everyone's appetite and get it kind of teed up. That's not, certainly decisions won't be made at that time. It will be just discussing, and we can bring those back to you and incorporate the commission in those final decisions.
Well, and I'll add, some of this will be dependent on what happens in the session.
Correct, absolutely. So it's all an evolving matter. Okay. Last item that I want to talk about is public safety sales tax. Not suggesting decisions get made here, but I want to provide a little bit of information on it and kind of some thoughts. So as we all know, the public approved a quarter-cent sales tax for 20 years, as I just mentioned to Commissioner Strand. It's effective April 1st, and we will start seeing money this summer. Based on our current level of taxes, I would estimate that on an annual basis, it will bring in about $8.5 million. And according to the ordinance, it is for the exclusive use for costs associated with fire and police operations, equipment, and buildings. So for context, I put together.
Susan, back up, if you bear with me. Here, we're going to have revenue beginning, and where will that revenue go?
It's coming
As it's
up.
okay, good.
Okay. So first of all, I want to give you a little context. Put together background on the 10-year history of public safety. I bucketed into 3 different groups: operating, capital, and debt service. Public safety, of course, is represented in the general fund. Consistently has remained about 43% of the general fund, but it has increased in dollar values from $33 million to $56 million. And then when you correlate that with the property tax receipts, which is like the third line down, in all of those years, it exceeds what we take in property tax revenues. That's primarily due to additional FTEs. Fire went from 121 to 141, which is primarily Station 8, and police authorized FTEs went from 179 to 216. On a capital side, the capital component of public safety has also increased. And then on the facility side, all the debt service payments are made out of the general fund, so we have to transfer those to a debt service fund. That again has also increased with the addition of Station 8 and the purchase of the police department, repair of Station 2, the new commitment with the triple RDC. So what that shows is that while of course the general fund has also increased, but public safety has increased from about 34 million in total to about 60 million in total. So I just want to set the tone with that. So obviously you're going to be tasked with allocating the new public safety sales tax. And so based on what I've presented, I suggest that we use a balanced approach. So as we contemplate melding this public safety sales tax into the overall budget, I think, we need to look at existing public safety obligations, known future obligations, and then any new developments, which could include compensation and adjustments to staff. And as we look at this, there's kind of 2 issues. The first one is kind of on the long term. I would suggest that starting for 26, we incorporate this whole discussion as part of the budget discussion every year. It gets built into the budget. However, for 2025, the budget is balanced. We don't need those funds to balance anything. So I think we need to look at that in a little different manner. And so I put together a couple slides to show a suggested kind of use for this. The numbers are just in there for, to see how the math works, but clearly it's going to be up to your discretion. So what I'm proposing as part of the budget process is that we're going to keep all of the revenues and all the money will come into a specific account so we can make sure we're tracking that all appropriately. I would suggest through, conversations with one of the chiefs, he suggested setting up kind of a capital fund for more of the long-term large items that, could come up. So I'd suggest we set aside something every year towards that. Then public safety equipment is a big draw on the general fund. At the bottom, I have a list of the 2025 budget requests that totaled $1.7 million. Currently, that's paid out of a fund called 475. It's funded by Enterprise. I would suggest we add a new fund, 476, that's public safety, and we would fund all or a portion of that with public safety sales tax. Then the difference will go to the general fund. Those are the pink and the blue. Previously, we didn't separate our revenues by department. We're going to do that with our new accounting system, so we could split that 50-50 or however you see fit. I would also suggest that we fund a portion or all of the existing debt service with that. And then the difference just remains in the general fund. And again, it's used toward existing obligations, obligations that we know are coming. For example, the Axon body-worn camera, that's going to be an $800,000 cost starting in 26 or 27 for 5 years. And then anything new that comes up as part of these future conversations, which could include some compensation changes or some staffing levels. We can also work with the pension as needed. So that would be my thought on how this could be integrated with the existing budget process. I'm going to just shift gears for a second and come back and talk to all of this. So this is something I would propose for this year's. As I mentioned, the budget is balanced. This is new revenue. While I said that we don't start collecting it until the summer, we actually are on an accrual basis, which means we will recognize 9 months or 75% in the year 2025. So 75% is like almost $4 million. So my suggestion for that is that we pick a number and use it as the seed money to start that capital fund. That will help us in starting to look long-term on what we're going to use that and set some money aside. It will also, be cash that's sitting there, which will help us on some calculations that we need in the short term. And then capital items, I think the capital budget for 25 is currently funded. So I think we need to see if there are things that are requested that were not funded in 2025. An example of that is something that you probably found in your consent agenda, the FAR report. So police department has been looking at movable barriers that are easy to set up and tear down. They applied for some grants and weren't awarded the grants. And then after the events in New Orleans, it just became a priority again. And due to the timing or the time lag of getting them, they want to get them for the summer events. They've requested funds to purchase movable barriers. It's about $400,000. And they've requested the sales tax, public safety sales tax, as the means to fund that. So we had a discussion at FAR, main point being you haven't even talked about how to spend that. But we, at the FAR committee, thought it was an appropriate use of those funds and that we would forward it on to the commission knowing that we were going to have this conversation. So do we want to talk about that now, or anyone have any questions on that? Because then the other use would be within operating whatever adjustments or modifications come with other things like compensation plan or adding staff.
I think there's an absolute expectation from voters that we pay our firefighters better and that we add more police officers. I think that's why, the firefighters went door to door, campaigned so hard, and that's why people voted for it, because they want to see more protection. And I think we do that as soon as we can. I would suggest doing that when the first funds come in, maybe get those hires for October and the pay increase in October, since the funds are coming, and make that our first step, and then see what we can put into the capital funds and other funds.
So I wanted to add, I do support starting a capital fund. I know Chief Dirksen and I have talked about that. I don't know, I think 3 million might be too much to start that, but I mean, the concept certainly I'm supportive of, but as I've asked for now several times, I do expect, like we do in the budget process, that because it's fire and police, that the two chiefs come forward with what they see as the priorities. And I will concur with Commissioner Turnberg's comments. We have to start with firefighter salaries. I know that there's data coming forward that's verifiable from fire, that is a competitive analysis with all associated documentation that is a starting place, but I also expect something to be done in salaries for firefighters with this, as part of this new money.
So I think there's a sense of agreement that we want more police and that there's a community desire for more wages, especially for entry-level firefighters. How do we mesh that with our HR approach where we have matrices and established paths forward for everybody to get wages and compensation adjustments? How do we parse out one department? I just don't know. I'm just trying to figure this out because I don't know. Can we? Could we, even if we wanted to?
Isn't that what all the voters agreed upon? I mean, it was like 70% are expect them to be paid.
I think that's what they voted for, yes, Commissioner, absolutely. But how do we do that?
Well, can't we just take the steps for the firefighters and?
That's my question.
So can I add, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
Nope.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So we had this conversation as part of kind of a review of the initial steps with the public safety sales tax implementation. And I think where we landed is using the data that's being collected and has been worked on, take a separate look collectively at police and fire together with some kind of facilitation, working with HR, but also some objective analysis of the data that's coming in. But also simultaneously, we have agreed to continue with work on compensation philosophy overall for all employees and coming back as part of the budgeting. What is that going to look like for everybody?
So John, to your question is we do treat firefighters and policemen different. 8 years, they get the double steps, they get a variety of different things. So compared to our other public work workers, they do get a different deal than that goes on with that. And the variety of reasons was to get people a competitive salary, keep them in our source. But I think, I think the commissioners are all kind of in agreement. We have to look at that wage issue. And Susan, why don't we start looking at that early rather than late?
Agreed.
And what I'd like to do is, couldn't we do a salary survey and as part of the budget for 26, even if we incorporate an October date or something, could we not do a study and can come to the commissioners May or June and say, here's our compensation recommendation? So we're not waiting until, it'd be nice to not have a budget fight about it. It should be just, here's what we feel we should do for this. Because, I mean, it will affect the budget, but the sales tax is covering some of the costs. So to me, it's almost sort of net neutral to the budget because you have sales tax that's supposed to cover that compensation. But could we, and I don't know, we have the chief's plan, we have the union's plan, we have the HR's plan. Do we need to bring just an outside referee in here and kind of figure out a firefighter or a public safety plan? Because it seems they're all a little bit different. And when I travel, talk to different mayors across the country, number one issue is safety, and police and fire are hard to hire, and there's difficulties that we have with that. But is there maybe a subspecialty consultant that could come in here and kind of work at that just for our city and help us out rather than, because when it comes out, whether it's the chiefs or Jill's or somebody's, I have the sense that the commission may not be happy with that result. So I'd like us to consider that at least.
Okay, I think that's something we will have to do, and we'll do it sooner rather than later. We just had these conversations. We haven't really had a chance to implement anything or even do any research on them. One of the things we talked about, though, is, as we look at the overall budget, last year, HR did an incredible amount of work on overall plan. And if, in fact, there is going to be some budget constraints this year, do we do a pause on that plan and focus on the public safety asks this year and do the full study next year. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about at the February cabinet meeting. And then when we come to this meeting in February, we'll have more of a plan forward, but we'll have answers to those questions.
In the meantime, while we're evolving our path forward, can we just tuck that money away into our cash reserves fund?
That's where it will
So
go.
that does a double whammy here, or double
Yes.
bang for the buck? We're also growing our, let's be realistic for a moment. Part of what we've just gone through is we've just bonded to fund the new police station. 12, 13, 14 million dollars, if I remember, or guessing. We just bonded, and we just funded fire station number 8.
And we're still paying for number 7.
And so we have those issues in already unfolding, and then we have our forward. So I'd say take that revenue, put it into the savings account, which is for everybody's benefit. When we bond, we'll get lower interest rates for new fire stations and new police stations,
Correct.
all that, but put it into the savings account for the moment
Yes, that is
and
where it will
dedicate
sit.
it. Good.
Yes, that's the intent of putting it into that one, so we can, that
So
particular.
that's your cap fund is that's where, that'll go into the reserve technically?
Well, it'll sit in that fund, but it is actually cash, so it will be invested with the rest of our pooled cash.
And back to HR, and we were going to have an HR study on fire, police, public safety, and then we've had an overall approach of all the HR positioning. Help me understand that bigger picture, Susan, the timing and the unfolding of it, and especially how do we hone in on, if we want more police over here and we want more wages for fire department, I'm trying to see how that unfolds.
I think Michael and Brenda are going to need to weigh in on that.
I can attempt to answer that, Commissioner Strand. So what I think we hear from the commission very clearly today is that we should talk about really 2025 activation of those funds. And so however we collect the data, whether it be with an independent party, whether it be with the fusing data, that we do that. And I heard October, I wrote that in my notes as well, but we will fuse that information that HR is collecting as well and put it together. So if that's the consensus of the commission, let us come back to that, perhaps at your February meeting with some idea and roadmaps for what that looks like. So I'll fuse in the rest of that HR context too.
So one last item I here, I just want to point out, though, that $400,000 of those movable barriers that is on the consent agenda for tonight is designated to come out of these funds. So if you wish to have more conversation about that, or
Well, garbage trucks don't work all the time. What we learned in New Orleans is these barriers will help us out. If you look at them, I'll have the chief send out what they look like, just so you know what
It's in the
they're
packet.
about. But they're portable, and we can, for street fairs or anything like that, we can protect our people. We would not like the New Orleans event to happen. We back pay it when the sales tax comes in. I think it'll be in by June, so that would be very helpful for us for summer events. And it's easier to deploy, it takes less public works man hours to get this stuff ready, so.
Susan, I just want to add one more point, just to have it on the record, that the other thing Chief Dirksen and I talked about is coming back with a 10-year strategy for capital needs. And it might include that study that has been proposed for several years that keeps getting removed because of budget, I get it, but it would be a good use of the funds for that work to be done. So that's another expectation I have. Thank you. And that's for both police and fire together.
And Susan, something else I'm sure we're all already paying attention to, I'm not sure, how much communication there is, but we need to pay attention to how much turnover there is in any of these departments. If there's fire department turnover, if that's an issue, because that's part of the issue that led to this was the lower wage levels relative to their expectations, relative to what others can offer. And if that's and in our police department as well. But if we're having issues with keeping our people right now, retaining workforce, that has to move up in priority. And I don't know if we're having erosion in our staff numbers now or not, but we just pay attention to that.
You're talking specific to public safety or?
I'm talking fire department numbers,
I'm sure
personnel.
that will be part of whatever analysis it is that we.
Because that's part of the discussions is how much turnover, how young the forces are becoming with people leaving and new people coming in and how old the average person is. But if that's an issue still, if we're having entry-level firemen leaving now or not taking the jobs right now, that has to become an urgent priority.
Commissioner Trimmer?
I think too, it's important to remember that what we've been watching California go through, and we have one of the highest rated fire departments in the country, and to keep them here and keep them at that level. And I think that residents I want to just reiterate that residents have overwhelmingly spoken that they want fire treated better with pay and they want more boots on the ground with police. And the sooner we can do that, I think the sooner taxpayers will be happy that they voted that in.
Okay. The universal signal. We will certainly come back to you with more information in February. Okay, so the last item, I just put in your materials. I don't expect us to take action today, but since I started, there've just been these kind of random odd requests regarding people donating to us or staff asking for contributions. So I think it would kind of help us all as we're looking at those decisions if we formalize a policy. So I have the draft in your information, and I think we can maybe look at it and approve it next month. However, I just have a couple live examples that kind of need an answer to, and in the absence of a policy, I think this is something that, unless you significantly object, we could, staff could give the approval. But one of the things that's in the FAR report is that the police department reported that they have encouraged the Police Foundation, the Old Badges of Unity, to solicit Giving Hearts Day for the purchase of 2 new canines. It's a great request, but I just wonder if that's something, if this or other things like that happen, do you want to be involved? Do you want to know in advance? Do you want them to kind of present their plan as part of a consent agenda item, bring it to FAR, we'll bring it forward in case it's something that you're not comfortable with, not necessarily police dogs, but just anything.
What was this for again, Susan?
The Badges of Unity group, it's the Police Foundation, and every year, like last year, they used Giving Hearts Day to raise money to go to the memorial. This year, they were brainstorming on ideas, and the chief and Travis suggested that we replace 2 canine dogs that are aging out, and so they thought that would be kind of a good spin on that event. So just want to make sure that you're comfortable with that, or just going forward if that's something you just want to be made aware of.
I think that goes to transparency. That's a great idea. But
Put it through FAR, and if you have any objections, you can raise it then. Same thing, kind of similar, harm reduction. Would like to start an Amazon wish page. There's a lot of generous people in town that would love to give gloves or granola bars or whatever. And do we have any objections to something like that? Just setting up a wish page that people can make donations that go to some of the harm reduction.
Susan, I don't know that we need to be putting our fingerprints on receiving donations, but we as a community certainly need to acknowledge the generosity of our people. Now, something that ties into this real similarly, I for the rest of the commission, I would like us to evolve our policies, what I call soft money budget items. And budget items that are maybe not necessarily core mission driven. And you saw me get into hot water last year when I raised about $800,000 worth of soft monies that we spend without discussing or approving or having policies to direct us. The other day I was in a discussion where we're internally talking about some more money for one of our entities, and this happens all the time, but I want us to have a policy that addresses that. So if somebody approaches Commissioner Strand, hey, would you donate money to this global youth soccer program, which has happened in the past, then it goes into a process, and it's not my fighting for it or going to Nicole to get money, which or used to be Dan Molly. But we need a policy. So if somebody requests money or somebody is divvying out money, or we have a bucket where that stuff all goes to, the Emerging Prairie $50,000 membership type stuff, I just want us to have a policy to address that, and a place and a lane where that all fits in, and it's not one politician or another, or a department head or another, where it gets into a level of, relative to our budget as well.
Okay. Those particular ones that you mentioned, I think we do talk about pretty specifically in the budget. And, there's not a lot of other things that I can think of that we would do that. I think I would need to get with Nicole and see the history of why we donate some of those, but that would be a different policy. That's not what I'm proposing here.
It's
Yeah.
because the mayor turns to Nicole and says, Nicole, can you come up with funding for this? And she does. We've done that how many times over years? But we don't have policies directing us, and it's also relative to Commissioner Pepcorn's desire, it's not transparent necessarily.
Okay, we can work on something like that. This policy is if we're going to be the recipient of donations. The other item that I want to bring up, see if anyone has any objections, again, a live item, is the YWCA would like to gift harm reduction an excess 12-passenger van that they have. It's like a 2012 model in fairly good condition, only has 56,000 miles on it, and I blue booked it, and it's like $12,000. So they don't need it any longer since they don't have their daycare, and they would like to gift it for harm reduction to use in some of their activities. So does anyone have an objection to that?
Thank them.
Yes, you just did.
So, Mr. Chair, I object to this. We have a fleet, we have fleet management, we're an organization where that's what we do. We don't need donations of vehicles, or does the city need donations of vehicles? There's a whole lot of questions about that. So, to me, I think those kinds of things should be reviewed by us. And so this gets back to that whole thing about transparency. So all the other departments, because they don't have an appeal, then they don't get donations. That's not right either. So I just think this all needs to go through the city commission, and this whole thing about getting donations to special groups, that's not right. That's not how this should operate.
So that's part of what I addressed in the policy. If we want to talk about that more thoroughly in February, it would be, at what point do you want things brought forward as a discussion item versus, if there's a dollar threshold that staff can make the decision. So I think we could further vet that policy. For this particular item, do you want that brought forward as a commission item to discuss? Because they would like to make that decision.
This goes back to the original conversation about, obviously, some of our departments are much more visible, and so, but it's our entire entity. We have lots of departments that aren't as visible, or let's say popular. They all deserve equal treatment. And so that's not what's happening now. Now we have special accounts and special increases for special employees. That's not how this should be. This should be across the board. And that's why I objected to the original thing. Now we're talking about special increases for just special departments. How about accounting? How about planning? How about engineering? None of them get considered in this anymore, and that's not how we should be governing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I will add that I appreciate the recommendation of the $5,000 threshold in the proposed donation policy. Of anything over $5,000 does come before commission, which I appreciate the transparency. And I appreciate the fact that we have a special sales tax that was voted in by the people, and it is for public safety. At the same time, as I said earlier, there should be simultaneous work happening that continues through HR on the rest of the compensation. Since that stalled last year, we ended with no compensation philosophy. I would hope that's coming forward sooner than later. And that work continues. The public safety tax very much was brought forward in the spirit of a new source of revenue that alleviates some of the pressure of the budget so that everyone gets more. And but with understanding that public safety is the biggest portion of our budget.
I think you have to remember, as commissioners, one time we were getting either new rifles or new helmets for our policemen, and one of the banks stood up and paid half the cost, was $60,000, $70,000, which was money we didn't have to take out of general fund. So sometimes donations do help us out, and it is something we should have a policy for. I agree with the policy. I think all the commissioners also should have the right to know kind of where the money goes, because oftentimes I get questioned, okay, we could go to this fund and get this fund for somebody or do something. So it just would be helpful if we know all the different donation quote funds we have, what the purpose is or what it goes to, badges of courage, what it's used for, because we had some issues come up with the policeman and, could we use it for that or not? But wouldn't mind at least having us educated on all the quote different donation funds that we have and what the general purpose of those funds are.
Currently, we only have two that we manage. One is the mammography fund through health, and one is the Gladys Ray Shelter. The Badges of Unity is a standalone entity. It's a foundation. They take care of their own money. They work closely with police, but we don't have anything to do with that from a finance standpoint.
So basically what you're trying to do is to have a methodology which when people want to give a donation, we can give it to the city of Fargo and then it can be managed?
Yes, and whether or not, is there a perception of, favoritism or things like that? I just want you to be able to see what it is and be comfortable with it. I don't want you to say, what do you mean we solicited money for a dog? We just need to have that information out there.
So this
Transparency.
policy that you have in the packet eventually would go to the commission
Yes.
for approval?
Yes, I just put it out there as a draft so we could have this
So we should
conversation.
look at that and modify Dave's concerns or whatever, one, if we change that if they'd like to change it.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes.
One of the other topics, I'll just, and we visited about it, and I've mentioned it here too, but we've shifted to Tyler for the software. And at the League of Cities, National League of Cities last year, the most exciting thing I saw was Tyler's use of artificial intelligence with cities and entities doing budgeting. They call it priority-based budgeting. And I know it's a process of getting in there and weighing your priorities, what are your priorities, but then you end up knowing what your priorities are, and then you have other things that are funded that aren't necessarily priority driven. But what the software and what they do is they help you understand, how did other people fund it? Are there grants out there? Are there funding revenue sources? So some of these topics and areas in the budget that don't necessarily have a direct revenue correlation and might be what I call soft money, they'll come back and say, well, why don't you do what Moorhead did? They got a grant over here for this. But this is going to be coming, and I can't wait to see this unfold.
Okay, well, curb your
Am I jumping
excitement.
the
We are
court?
really early in this. We did have some demos, and, in order to do this, there's a lot of configuration, and that is, we know you're interested, but it'll be a bit of a back burner. We want to make sure we're getting our data converted and our reports running before we do that. The comment that I made to Commissioner Strand when he mentioned this, I'm excited that you're excited, but we always do priority-based budget. That's what we do. That's what a budget is. That's what you do in your personal life. It's what you do here. So, the biggest thing we're going to need to do is come to a consensus on what are the priorities, and AI isn't going to do that for us. That's going to have to be you. So.
We decide the priorities.
Yes, you
Yes.
decide the priorities. That's all I got, and it is 10:29. That was pretty good.
Calendar? Calendar? Do you want to discuss calendar on agenda?
Forgot about that. I did put a calendar in the last page that is our, I've scheduled bi-monthly finance committee meetings, just so they're on the calendar, but if we feel like we need to do them more frequently, we certainly can. So I just have some placeholders, and that's the last page. The next one, I think, is the 28th or something like that. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your very busy day.
Thank you, Susan. Nice job. Nice to have the staff here. Appreciate it. And thanks for the great discussion. Thank you. We're adjourned.